Welcome in, everybody, to the voice of college football on Notre Dame. I am your host, Patrick Previty. Today, we're going to be talking about all things Notre Dame football, but mainly we're going to be talking about the kicking situation, Mike Martin, and Ty Washington. Ty Washington is the new transfer coming in from Arkansas. We're going to be talking about him and giving a bit of a player overview. That is the transfer that I chose for this episode. Now, just wanted to give another little channel update. I want to make some videos throughout this upcoming week that are separate from this live, but we're going to have about 3 videos on those topics throughout the rest of this week that we're going to be able to talk about. So obviously, Mike Martin is the new general manager for Notre Dame football, and he's tasked with hopefully continuing on to bring talent and continuing to make this Notre Dame football team a pretty much professional looking football team. That'll be very important for them going forward, and his vision with Marcus Freeman. He comes in from Detroit, and obviously we're going to want to continue to, add and build momentum from this national championship season. So let's get into that. I did also see some injuries that happened throughout this week for spring practice. That started up. That's another thing that I want to touch on as this week goes on, is who exactly went down and the quarterback situation. Those will probably be the 2 other videos that I make through this week, talking about Steve Angeli, Kenny Minchie, CJ Carr, seeing how that shapes up as the week goes on, as well as any positional battles that look to be shaping up early in the spring and may not be as big of a question in the fall. But as I mentioned, let's talk about Mike Martin. Choose hard, team glory. Those messages sound great at a press conference, and they look great at a t-shirt. He just recently had one, and they're nice things that coaches preach all of the time, but they aren't really more than words usually. That's not the case with Marcus Freeman and his program. We saw his players and staff embody those words this season, and it's pretty evident with the overall talent on this roster. And there's an uptick in blue chip ratio as far as the recruits are concerned, and the buy-in is there. The buy-in was not as much there with Brian Kelly, but it is certainly there as far as a culture standpoint with Marcus Freeman. Now, a lot of the Mike Martin job is concerned with players opting out. The transfer portal, we only saw 1 player opt out during the season for Notre Dame. No players entered the transfer portal at the conclusion of the regular season prior to the playoffs. And that is very different than some of the other teams that we saw, such as Georgia and Penn State, who lost key starters as after the season concluded as well. Only 6 players from Notre Dame decided to hop into the transfer portal at the end of the year after the playoffs. And again, that would be different as when you compare them to maybe an Ohio State or a Georgia or a Penn State or any of the other teams that made a deep run into the college football playoff. The projected starters, none of them opted out. Okay, that is huge. That shows a level of buy-in that is not at every single program. So Mike Martin is tasked with hopefully continuing on that, to help continue that on. It's not something that is very easy to do, and you're going to have to make these young players feel wanted. It's not easy to retain players in the college football era, the transfer portal era, and certainly even if you're able to tell them that they can start, they're not always going to 100% have that buy-in, and they might end up throwing their hat in the transfer portal. It's not easy to say how you can keep young people as, a part of your program. But one story I did want to mention is the Xavier Watts story. As we all know, he won the Nagurski and was just an amazing player for this defense last year. But in his first year, he redshirted, moved to wide receiver. Second year, moved to defensive back and played very little. In his third year, he finally was able to get the start, and he was okay. He wasn't the player that we saw in his 4th and final year here at Notre Dame. How are you going to get those players to buy in? On one hand, you have another young freshman cornerback who's a difference maker, Leonard Moore, on the defense and the secondary. Both of those stories are very valid. They are extremely pertinent to this type of program. At one end, you're going to have a player who is good from the jump, like Leonard Moore. On the other, you're going to have a guy like Xavier Watts, who doesn't really come on until later in his career. If you're Mike Martin, how do you get that player who's not learning more to stick around in the program to become a guy like Xavier Watts? Also, how do you get a guy like Leonard Moore to stick around in the program when he could potentially go anywhere else? It's the culture that you've established. You don't want to go anywhere else. So with those buzzwords at that press conference, this is kind of laying the foundation to continuing on a culture that Marcus Freeman has built. Now, Watts was kind of a different case. He's a different type of person. And maybe if it was somebody else who had a different outlook on things, they would leave. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to Mike Martin to keep those guys in-house. Part of his job is to find talent, but it's not going to be at the expense of finding the right people that fit Notre Dame and Freeman's program. He had a couple quotes that I wanted to share from this press conference that he had earlier on in the week, where he was just kind of talking about how they were going to continue to build. He says, I think process is a big part of what I believe in. I think to everything, there's a process, and developing out those processes and being well thought out with those processes are a big thing, even in evaluations. There's a lot more than seeing a talented kid play football. There's a lot more that goes into it, digging and figuring out the background of kids. I'm a big believer in the intangibles. So character will be a big part. I know here there are so many people of character. If you don't have that, and if you're not of a certain yoke, you'll be a little out of place here. I want to share, or I want to make sure you guys understand the process for me starts with character. I think that's huge, and I think that completely aligns with what Marcus Freeman wants to do. There are very few recruits that are ready to make an impact right away, especially since we saw all of those guys staying over from the COVID era, and a lot of players will be paid more than they potentially would make in the NFL, so they're going to stay even longer. It's all about being able to keep those guys in-house, and only have 6 guys enter the transfer portal at the end of the playoffs. None enter the transfer portal after the regular season, and only 1 opt out during the season. That is already an amazing sign for this program. Now, Martin worked for the Detroit Lions before his opportunity at Notre Dame. A big part of what drew him to this job was the similarities between the two organizations. Obviously, now we're seeing the transition from a lot of college football programs into looking like professional teams. The culture starts at the top and it trickles down from there. He had another quote about Jack Kaiser. Jack Kaiser probably said it, Jack Kaiser had a quote. Jack Kaiser said, it's the people, and Detroit, there's a lot of, after the national championship game, he was saying it was the people and it was the culture that kind of was able to give this team the momentum to get into the playoffs. Mike Martin also had a quote that kind of built off of that. Detroit, there's a lot of awesome people there. Dan Campbell is one of the most sincere people and a great person. Brad Holmes is the same. I felt a lot of the similarities here from the moment I met Coach Freeman and all of the staff. My staff currently is just a great feel. That's what makes this place special and what drew me to this place. There's always something to be learned from teams that win. One of the most important things to take away from Notre Dame's success last season is that character matters. And Mike Martin is going to continuously try to learn Notre Dame's culture and keep, building off of how you can not only find the best players, but also keep them in-house and make this Notre Dame football program one with extremely high culture, as it already has. Now, am I too worried about what is going to happen and what is going on with some of these freshmen or anybody that goes in the transfer portal? That's kind of up to you guys to assess. I don't really think this team has too much of an issue with losing guys in the transfer portal, but I definitely think that is something that could come in years down the line whenever we do get more 4 or 5 stars, and you could potentially see some of those guys hopping in the transfer portal instead of sticking around. Not everybody, like I said, is like Xavier Watts. And Mike Martin is just at a certain point going to, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. But it's all about making sure that you can kind of pick out the players that you think might be able to stay a little longer, as long as you also value them and you want to continue to try to coach them through all 4 years. You don't leave, and dip out on them. A lot of these guys were still from the Brian Kelly era, the older guys. We're kind of seeing them leave now as time goes on. But if you can keep those guys in-house, from the Brian Kelly era through the start of the Freeman era, then you should be able to keep the recruits that came here just for Marcus Freeman. So I really like Mike Martin. I love the hire. I made a video on that a couple weeks ago when it happened, about a month ago, actually, I should say. And I'm completely in on the Mike Martin hire at Notre Dame. As you guys trickle on in here, you guys can ask any sort of questions, what I think about what's going on with spring practice and everything like that. Not too much to report on. I mean, mainly just a couple guys going down, but for the most part, this team's still figuring out everything. Obviously, this is Spring Ball and Kickers, the Notre Dame live show. I did want to get into the kicking situation. So Mitch Jeter last season suffered an injury right around after the first 3 games of the year. We didn't really have any kicking problems prior to that, but after that injury, he just wasn't the same player. We saw it towards the end of the season. He was kind of gaining some momentum back, but obviously in the national championship game, he missed a kick. And we're thinking that there's going to have to be a solution in the transfer portal again. This will be the 3rd straight year where Notre Dame gets their starting kicker, as it projects, from the transfer portal. Mitch Jeter now goes to the NFL. That starting kicker is Noah Burnett from North Carolina. He had a solid career with the Tar Heels. He's 5'10", ended last season nailing 39 of 40 extra points. I'd like to get that to 40 out of 40. Hopefully it will be. And he went 15 of 21 on field goals last season. He was 5 for 5 in field goals from 20 to 29, 3 of 4 in field goals from 30 to 39, and 5 of 8 in field goals from 40 to 49 yards. 2 of 4 from 50 or longer, showing that he kind of can have that range. That wasn't something that he was touted to have coming out of high school, but it was definitely something that I think he has shown, especially at his time at North Carolina. He's kicked in big games, including Florida State, at Minnesota, and at Virginia in 2024. In 2023, he kicked in games at Pittsburgh, at Clemson, and at West Virginia. 2023 was his best season of his career. He finished the year as a second-team All-ACC selection, and he went 43 of 43 in extra points that season and knocked down 19 of 20 field goal attempts, including 6 for 6 from 40 to 49 yards. He's a very accurate kicker. We're not going to be one of those programs that's going to be able to kick, to attempt field goals with confidence anywhere beyond 51, 52 yards. But if you can really knock down those field goals, which we didn't really have full confidence in last season, I think that that's a plus. And when we have a guy who's kicked in those big games, I think that that is certainly going to be an addition, no matter how it ends up playing out, whether or not he can get back to that 2023 form or whether or not he's like the same player that he was last season. No matter what, it will be better than, unfortunately, what we had in Mitch Jeter when he was hurt. Notre Dame, like I mentioned, gone to the transfer portal last season. Again, it would be the 2nd straight season last season. This year's 3rd straight. They were ranked number 128 in field goal percentage. They only made 55.6% of field goals attempted last season. 15 of 27 would be the exact fraction for that. Once Jeter was injured, there was just no viable replacement for him. And now we turn to the transfer portal. So who else is on this roster that could potentially also be kicking field goals for Notre Dame? Well, it comes from a young man, a true freshman, who is going to be kicking for potentially for the future, not this next season, but after this. And I definitely think that I could see a true freshman potentially taking the reins at some point next season, making a couple of kicks, but I don't really think that this is going to be his specific year. Now, Schmidt, he was a true freshman, or he is going to be a true freshman, so he is not kicking in the spring. He's got that power, that kicking power. That's something that maybe we potentially won't have in Burnett, but we were not going to be able to see it until fall camp. James Rendell returns as the punter, so it looks like right now field goal kicking will be the only duty that these kickers are going to have to take on. Looks like we're still going to have the same kickoff man as we did last year. As I mentioned, Burnett, he's similar to Mitch Jeter in that accuracy and size. Neither kind of have the kicking power that you would really, really love, but certainly something that we can also say that he can do. He drilled 2 field goals from 40 to 49 yards last season. Both of those were against Pitt, and in 2023, he played very well. He still made 79.2% of his field goals, 98.3% of his extra points in 2024. And 2023, he was better than that. This provides much needed depth, and I'm very excited to have a competent kicking situation for Notre Dame in the future. Now, something I wanted to touch on in this video was also Ty Washington. tight end from Arkansas. We've been talking a lot about the wide receivers in this offseason. Who exactly is going to step up? Is it going to be Jaden Greathouse? Is it going to be one of the transfers, Malachi Fields, who we will not see in the spring? Or Will Pauling, who comes over from Wisconsin? Or is it also somebody else that we have on the roster? Well, we'll see what the wide receiving room looks like as spring goes on and as the quarterback battle kind of figures itself out, or however much it could potentially figure itself out. But one thing that we do know for sure, no matter what happens with the quarterbacks and what happens with the wide receivers, we needed depth at the tight end position. Both guys both players who are in the lead right now for the starting tight end position outside of Ty Washington aren't going to be in spring. One transferring in, the other is injured. So obviously he's not going to be participating in spring practice. Ty Washington comes over from Arkansas. He was there for 3 seasons, redshirted in 2022, and then obviously had his redshirt freshman year. That was probably his best season. As a redshirt sophomore last season, he was dismissed from the team. He cited issues with health with his grandmother, so it kind of was clouding his judgment during one of the games that they had. And after that game, he was dismissed from the team. But supposedly everything has been figured out, kind of talked through, and Notre Dame's coaching staff is kind of on the same page with how he wants to conduct himself this upcoming season. And he's looking for that breakout year to build off of what he did in his first season. Now, as I mentioned, Notre Dame's tight end room is going to kind of look for some more depth. Eli Raridan is slotted to be that number 1 guy in the room. If he's healthy, that is his main issue. He began his career with the Irish tearing his ACL twice in 10 months. So seeing him on the field and consistently in 2024 was promising, but we're still looking for somebody who can be potentially more reliable. There are certain positions on this Notre Dame roster that have players that haven't taken a ton of snaps. This is one of them, but I would say it's more so it can be a very deep room. It's just one of those things where it's like, how much can you rely on each of those players? I think that is super interesting to watch. But let's break down Ty Washington now that we've gotten all of that aside and his background. He's 6'4", 250 pounds, and he's a great threat downfield in the passing game, something that we didn't really have as much last season, as much as we would have wanted with Riley Leonard. Ty Washington could hopefully bring that to the tight end position as well. He over 3 seasons for Arkansas, he participated in 21 games and had 14 receptions for 212 yards and 4 touchdowns. His most productive period, as I mentioned, was when he was a redshirt freshman in the year 2023, where he had 11 catches, 170 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, I think he can add some depth. I don't know if he's going to beat out Eli for that number 1 tight end position, but I definitely think he's got the talent to be able to do so. I definitely think that last year was a bit of an aberration for him as a player, with everything personally going on, as well as getting dismissed from the team and only being able to register 3 catches on the season. But, you know, that's just my own outsider opinion. We'll see exactly how much he participates in spring ball. Obviously, it's going to be something that is watched closely by the coaching staff to be able to compare some of these guys. Can he be that reliable number 2 tight end on this squad? We obviously know that this team runs a lot of sets with 2 tight ends, and that is not a position that is just not used for Notre Dame. Tight end university, and hopefully Ty Washington can be that kind of player who ends up filling the shoes of some of the great tight ends that have come before him and can help out in the passing game in that way. He's got good ability to make plays in space, stretch the field vertically, and has good run after the catch potential. So all of these things make him a very dynamic player, and it's kind of why I've picked him as one of the players that I've wanted to talk about today. I definitely think he needs some work with his run blocking, but that is something that other tight ends for Notre Dame will also have to work on in the offseason. I think that's just a general problem with this tight end room, and not something that I think would potentially disqualify him from being the number 2 tight end on this roster, or being the number 1 tight end on this roster, because I do think it's a pretty open race considering the injuries and the lack of snap count. Him coming in, having 3 years under his belt of college football experience, I think will certainly help. He's going to be a strong runner who can make defenders miss after making a catch in traffic. He had a catch, now I wanted to highlight this, against Ole Miss, where he was able to kind of truck some of the players, and I think that's the play that we saw the most potential from him from last season. I'm very excited to see what Ty Washington can do for this offense, and he's definitely a player to look out for. Now, these 20 minutes have kind of gone by very, very fast, so I did want to just kind of take a second to take a break and to really kind of dive into what exactly we think this Notre Dame can be next year. I made a video on setting expectations, how good I think this team can be next year. What is a failure? What is a success? I think a success is making it to the playoffs and winning a game. I think a failure would be just missing the playoffs entirely. I think this schedule is tougher than it was last season. As I mentioned in the video, we start the year with Miami, and we still got Texas A&M. We don't have to go, like we don't have to go too many weeks with playing very, very top tier opponents, but it's still something that you have to look out for. Got quality ACC opponents on the schedule. Obviously, still have USC, no matter how that rivalry looks, still have them on the schedule. I think it's a very doable schedule to get 11 wins against, and I think that's what it'll take to make the college football playoff, and I think Notre Dame has that ability. So if they weren't able to get it, even with a new starter at their quarterback position, I think this season would be a disappointment. I think Marcus Freeman has set a culture, so we'll just have to see how that ends up playing out as far as whether or not, if this team suffers losses again this season to inferior opponents such as NIU, whether they can bounce back. I think they will be able to, but it all remains to be seen. It all remains to be seen. But guys, thank you so much for clicking on this live. Hopefully you guys watch it after the fact as well. Want to come out with more videos throughout the week and want to make these lives a little bit longer, potentially looking for a co-host here at the Voice of College Football on Notre Dame, so we can kind of get really in depth more times than just Monday nights every single week, where we can really just dive into exactly what's going on after practice and talk more about some of the press conferences that go on throughout the week, some of the media availability, not just Mike Martin, although I thought it was very interesting what his comments for the culture were. But yeah, I want us to run up the score on the Canes. I would love that too. I think this team has a really good chance at defeating Miami. I just think that Miami is extremely good, and even though they've replaced pretty much every receiver that they've had, as well as losing Elijah Arroyo, I still think they're a really good program who's had a lot of really great recruiting classes. Under Mario Cristobal over the last, I think since he's been there, right? Like last 3 years or so, they've had top 15 recruiting classes. So, they can recruit. So they got guys. And I also think Carson Beck is a darn good quarterback who I believe would really start for Notre Dame, honestly. But I hope we end up getting into a position where we can make that score look good too, because it would be very, very tough to explain a ton of close wins again if we were 10-2. Maybe if this team has 2 losses, I don't know if they can. I really can't even entertain that. But if they were to have 2 losses, whether or not they should get into the college football playoff. But you don't see it all the time, but it could potentially happen. You never know. But I certainly think there's an uptick in the schedule, so maybe there's a better shot than there was this past year. You can't lose to NIU again and have another loss. And we all knew that when that loss occurred last season, that they were just going to have to run the table to make the playoffs. Certainly playoffs weren't even really talked about at that point because it was such an unfortunate loss, but I sure hope that we can dominate some of the teams, especially to start up the year. If we were able to dominate the Hurricanes at the very start of this upcoming football season, I think that puts this team sky high as far as confidence goes, and I think it really helps us going in to beat Texas A&M after beating the Hurricanes. I mean, this Notre Dame team could be ranked as high as top 4 if they were able to rattle off those wins within the first 3 weeks of the season. I think that would be huge, but obviously we're in March now, mid-March. But thank you guys so much for stopping on in, and I will see you guys next time with more Notre Dame football content.